Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Bonnie Zampino, Director of Communications and Outreach for Rock Harbor Truth, and this is The Cult on the Cape. This new podcast series is about the community of Jesus in Orleans, Massachusetts, and the long shadow it casts. But before we begin, a brief content warning. These episodes contain references to religious abuse, physical violence, child abuse, and coercion. Listener discretion is advised. This first episode is different from the rest of this series. Over the next 5 episodes, you'll hear from 3 women who lived inside the community of Jesus and its affiliated boarding school in Canada. They survived it, they escaped it, and they wrote books to tell the truth of what happened there. But before we hear their stories, we need to understand the world they came from, what the community of Jesus actually is, how it formed, who led it, and how it gained the power to control hundreds of lives across 2 countries for more than 5 decades. To do that, travel with me back to 1958, where a chance meeting of 2 women began a partnership that would shatter lives across continents for generations. 2 different countries, 2 different institutions, 1 system of control. If you've never heard of the community of Jesus, picture this: a beautiful, windswept corner of Cape Cod, clapboard houses, stone buildings, a bell tower, choirs singing sacred music, carefully staged images of reverence, beauty, and peace. Now imagine that behind that beauty, there's a system built on control, humiliation, and spiritual abuse. And if you've never heard of Grenville Christian College, imagine a prestigious boarding school in Ontario, Canada. Uniforms, chapel, discipline, education, a place that for years sold itself as a strong Christian environment for children. The public image of both places looked holy, respectable, and safe. But survivors from both institutions tell eerily similar stories: the same language, the same punishments, the same obsession with obedience, the same breaking down of the individual in the name of God. That's not a coincidence. There is a direct documented connection between the community of Jesus and Grenville Christian College. Today, we're going to walk through that history. We'll start on Cape Cod in the late 1950s. 2 women, Kay Anderson and Judy Sorensen, who would eventually be called Mother Kay and Mother Judy, had a chance meeting at the Church of the Holy Spirit in Orleans, Massachusetts. They became close, unusually close, according to people who knew them at the time. Their friendship eventually deepened into both a romantic and a religious partnership. They kept their romantic relationship private, but their public one became the foundation of their growing spiritual influence. They began leading small prayer and fellowship groups. This was during the early days of the charismatic renewal movement, when many Christians were experimenting with new forms of worship, community, and spiritual power. Kay and Judy's little circle grew, and they began to travel throughout New England, leading retreats and religious conferences. Their teachings focused on confession, obedience, and living in the light. Slowly, their group evolved from a loose fellowship into something much more structured and much more controlling. By 1970, this group had a nonprofit status, and the former Rock Harbor Manor bed and breakfast on the shores of Rock Harbor in Orleans, Massachusetts, became the Andersons and Sorensens' home together, as well as a retreat center, a chapel, and a meeting place. This is where the community of Jesus took root. Members came. They sold their homes, gave up careers, moved to Cape Cod, and turned over personal choice, from where they lived to whom they married, to whether their children would be taken from them to be raised in other households. Kay and Judy became known only as the mothers. Every aspect of life was controlled. Private thought was considered rebellion. Personal boundaries were called sin. Former members described daily life as a system of surveillance and emotional domination. One of the defining practices inside the community was something called light sessions, where members, including children, were confronted, broken down, and forced to confess sins, real or imagined, in front of others. These sessions could last for hours or even days. Alongside light sessions, the community enforced public humiliation rituals where people were corrected and shamed in front of others. Restrictive appearance controls, from haircuts to clothing and posture, even facial expressions. Isolation and shunning, where one was not allowed to speak or be spoken to, sometimes for months. And a hierarchical control, with Mother Kay and Mother Judy at the top, their directives treated as divinely inspired. As this was happening in Massachusetts, pieces were moving into place hundreds of miles away in Canada. Our second thread starts with a couple named Al and Mary Haig. In 1961, Al and Mary met Kay and Judy when Kay and Judy stayed at Mary's parents' home. At this point, it was just a connection, a relationship. But it's important because it was the bridge between the community of Jesus and a Canadian boarding school. Over the next few years, Al and Mary moved deeper into Christian education. In 1967, Al was hired as a headmaster of a girls' school on Long Island, and Mary became Dean of Women. They were educators, leaders, and like Kay and Judy, they were drawn to intense forms of Christian community and discipline. In 1968, when that school ran into financial trouble, Al and Mary connected with a group in Texas called the Berean Fellowship. There, they met Charles and Betty Farnsworth, and they all became part of that fellowship. A year later, in 1969, Al and Mary were asked to go back to Canada to start a boarding school. They found a property in Brockville, Ontario, what used to be St. Mary's College, and put a down payment on it. They invited the Farnsworth and other staff from Texas to join them. That school opened its doors in September of 1969 and was called Berean Christian School. This school would later change its name and become known as Grenville Christian College. So by the end of the 1960s, we have a developing, high-control religious community on Cape Cod and a Christian boarding school in Ontario run by people already connected to Kay and Judy. The bridge was built. Then the traffic began. In 1972, the connection between these two institutions became more direct. Al and Mary met David Manuel, a book editor and a member of the Community of Jesus. Through him, they visited the Community of Jesus for the first time. That was a turning point. They weren't just vaguely aware of Kay and Judy anymore. They were walking the grounds at Rock Harbor. They were seeing the community's life close up. They were hearing the teachings, feeling the hierarchy, watching how Kay and Judy operated. Then, on April 28, 1973, Kay and Judy traveled the other direction. They came to Berean Christian School in Brockville. It was supposed to be a quick visit, 2 days. They stayed 2 weeks. Think about that. The founders of a high-control religious community show up at a boarding school, and instead of just giving a guest lecture and leaving, they embed themselves. They met staff, they met students, they started shaping things, teaching daily about how to use light sessions and live the way of the cross. They preached multiple times a day about death to self, death to pride, jealousy, disobedience, and willfulness. They implemented disciplines like forced silence, boot camps, forced labor, and sleep deprivation. A few months later, on July 9, 1973, a large group from Berean traveled down to the Community of Jesus to spend a weekend there. There's a moment from that visit that really captures the power dynamic. In an outdoor chapel service at the community, Staff from Grenville and their children agreed, on the spot, to change their dress and hairstyles to fit the community standards. No jeans, no short skirts. Hair was cut right then and there. This wasn't casual influence. This was indoctrination and control. In late August of 1974, it went even further. Al and Mary Haig visited the Community of Jesus along with about 50 of their staff. During that visit, Kay and Judy strongly suggested that Al stay for a while. So he ended up living at the Community of Jesus from September to November 1974, about 3 months, as a live-in. During that time, he was under the direct control of the Community of Jesus leadership and their system of spiritual authority. He was not just visiting, he was being formed. Shortly after this intensive period, the school in Brockville changed its name. Berean Christian School became Grenville Christian College. So by the mid-70s, we have a boarding school whose headmaster just spent 3 months being disciplined inside the Community of Jesus, a staff that followed Kay and Judy's directives on dress, appearance, and authority, and students and staff traveling back and forth between Brockville and Orleans. Grenville Christian College didn't just resemble the Community of Jesus by coincidence. It was being shaped by it. As time went on, the relationship between the institutions didn't fade. It deepened. Grenville's co-founders and headmasters became vowed members of the Community of Jesus. In 1976, 7 or 8 kids from the Community of Jesus were sent to Grenville Christian College on scholarship. Survivors report that they weren't treated as special guests. They were treated like staff kids. In other words, the same harsh discipline, the same expectations followed them across the border. Behind the scenes, financial and legal ties began to form as well. Over the 1980s and 1990s, Grenville and the Community of Jesus exchanged land, easements, and property rights in Orleans. First, lots 30 and 31. Then other parcels. Easements were granted, deeds were traded. A Massachusetts nonprofit was formed, the Grenville Christian College Foundation, with officers from both worlds, leaders from the Community of Jesus and leaders from Grenville. This was not a casual relationship. This was an entangled system, spiritually, financially, and organizationally. But by the 1980s, people began escaping from both places, and they began talking. Former members of the Community of Jesus reported physical beatings, forced feeding and forced fasting, sleep deprivation, child abuse, separation of families, forced confessions, and psychological torture described as spiritual discipline. Major newspapers began publishing their stories. And then in 2007, Grenville Christian College abruptly closed amid allegations of abuse and cult-like practices. In the years that followed, documentation surfaced confirming what survivors had long understood. Grenville staff traveled regularly to the Community of Jesus. The Community of Jesus leaders held roles within Grenville-related foundations. Most of the staff at Grenville had taken vows to the Community of Jesus leadership, and property and money moved between the two institutions. After the shutdown, the Grenville Christian College Foundation changed its name. Mortgages were discharged. Nonprofit board officers were removed, all in an effort by the Community of Jesus to distance itself from the now disgraced Canadian institution. But survivors kept telling their stories. In 2019, a class action lawsuit went to trial in Ontario. In 2020, the judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, recognizing the systemic abuse at Grenville and stating that the school adopted a strict corrective approach to education inspired by the Community of Jesus' values of submission and obedience. Then in 2021, the Canadian investigative show The Fifth Estate aired 2 episodes. The first focused on abuse at Grenville, and its ties to a US-based cult. The second dug into that cult itself, the Community of Jesus. For the broader public, that was a revelation. But for the survivors, it was simply what they had already known for decades. These were not isolated places. This was a networked system of control. So why are we starting our podcast with this history? Because to understand the stories you'll hear in this series, from survivors of Cape Cod, from former students in Ontario, and from people whose lives were shaped by obedience, fear, and enforced brokenness, you need to understand the system that they were trapped in. Not two stories, one story. In our next episode, you'll hear what it was like to actually endure these practices, the light sessions, the shunning, the control, from people who survived them. We're going to talk about what happened, what's still happening, and why it matters now. I'm your host, Bonnie Zampino, and this is The Cult on the Cape.